I remember the first night I heard about it. One of the younger guards came into the break room with his face drained of color, his hands wrapped tight around a mug of cold coffee as if he needed something solid to hold on to. He said there was an animal outside the east fence. Not circling it, not prowling. Just sitting, watching the wall with the kind of patience that didn't belong to the wild. The kind that belonged to something that knew exactly what it was waiting for. I didn't believe him at first. We were deep in the Ranthambore buffer zone. And yes, there were tigers in those forests, we all knew that. But they kept their distance from human structures. That was the unspoken agreement between our world and theirs. They stayed in the trees, and we stayed behind our walls. But the next morning, I walked the perimeter myself, and I saw the prints, pressed deep into the soft earth just beyond the fence line, facing inward. Not the tracks of an animal passing through. The tracks of an animal that had stood still in one place for a very long time. The warden was informed. He ordered extra patrols that night, and the night after that, the forest department was called. A motion-activated camera was set up near the east wall, angled toward the tree line, and we waited. We all assumed it would stop. Animals don't form habits around human places. Not like that. Not without a reason. The camera footage from the first night showed her arriving just after 10. She came out of the darkness slowly, without urgency, and sat down about 15 meters from the fence. She was large, a fully grown female, her coat rich with black stripes over burnt orange, though even through the grainy footage I could see that her fur was not entirely healthy. It was dull in places, slightly matted along her left flank, the kind of wear that comes not from disease but from time and neglect. She had been living hard, but her eyes. Even on that small screen, her eyes were something I had no scientific language for. They were fixed on the prison wall with an expression that was not aggression, not curiosity, but something older and quieter than both. Something that, I'm not ashamed to say, looked exactly like grief. She stayed until just before dawn. Then she stood, turned without haste, and disappeared back into the forest. The next night, she came again. By the end of the first week, none of us called the forest department anymore. There was a silent consensus among the guards that this was not a threat situation. We didn't have the words for what it was, so we mostly didn't speak about it at all. We just watched the footage each morning, noted that she had come and gone, and carried on with our shifts. But I kept thinking about it. I kept returning to those prints in the earth and to that image on the screen. A wild animal sitting alone in the dark, her face turned toward a wall of concrete and iron. I had worked in that prison for 6 years by then, and I thought I had seen most of what grief looked like when it was locked behind a fence. I had never expected to see it on the outside of one. By the third month, the younger guards had given her a name among themselves. They called her the Sentinel. None of us knew then that she would still be there 3 years later. None of us knew the name she already had, or the man behind that wall who had given it to her. I learned about Daniel Mehta the way you learn about most things in a place like that, in fragments, passed from mouth to mouth in the corridor between shifts, until a shape began to form from all the pieces. He had been a forest ranger for the Ranthambore Reserve for nearly 14 years before the night everything fell apart. And by all accounts, he was not the kind of man you forgot easily. He was the sort of ranger who didn't just patrol the forest. He inhabited it. The older staff at the reserve would tell you he knew those 400 square kilometers the way most people know the layout of their own homes. Instinctively, without having to think, with a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with paperwork or jurisdiction. He had started young, barely 22, fresh from a wildlife biology program in Jaipur. And he had spent his first years learning to be still enough that the forest stopped noticing him. That was how he had found Kira. Or rather, that was how Kira had found him. She was no more than 6 weeks old when he came across her. Deep in the eastern corridor of the reserve, hidden beneath the roots of a fallen sal tree. Her mother had been killed 2 nights earlier by poachers, one of 3 tigers taken that season before the arrests finally came, and the cub had survived by some miracle of stillness and silence. She had not made a sound. She had simply waited the way her instincts told her to, for something to come back that was never coming back. Daniel had radioed the situation in and waited with her through the night. Protocol was to transfer orphaned cubs to the rehabilitation center in Sawai Madhopur, and that is what happened. But Daniel made the drive himself. The cub wrapped in his field jacket in the passenger seat, and he was the one who stayed at the center through the first critical weeks when she refused to eat. He sat outside her enclosure every evening after his shift, not interacting, not forcing anything, just being present, just being a body in the dark that wasn't a threat. She started eating on the 4th week. The staff said it was the feeding schedule and the formula adjustment. Daniel never argued with them. But I was told that from that point on, Kira would press her enormous head against the chain link whenever he arrived. closing her amber eyes with a weight that the center's veterinarian called, in her official notes, an unusual tolerance response. Daniel called it by a simpler name. He called it trust. She was partially rehabilitated over the following 2 years. Wild enough to hunt, to navigate her territory, to live as a tiger should. But she had been marked with a tracking collar, and her range kept her close to the eastern corridor where Daniel worked most of his shifts. They were not companions in any domestic sense. He was not her keeper, but there was a thread between them that even the most skeptical of his colleagues acknowledged. When Kira was located near the fence roads, she was almost always near Daniel too. Then came the accusation. A poaching syndicate that Daniel had spent 3 years working to expose turned the investigation back on him. Falsified evidence, a bribed informant, a case constructed with the cold patience of people who had a great deal to lose and no moral hesitation about how they protected it. The trial lasted 4 months. The verdict, when it came, was the kind that hollows a person from the inside out. He was sentenced to 3 years. He walked into that prison in the dry heat of an October afternoon, and somewhere in the forest behind him, a tiger with amber eyes and a dull patch on her left flank turned her face toward the east and began to wait. There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a prison. It is not the silence of empty spaces or quiet rooms. It is a silence made of suppressed sound, of voices and footsteps and metal doors that have learned to exist within rigid boundaries. Daniel told me later that what he missed most in those first months was not freedom in any abstract sense. It was the sound of the forest at night. He had spent 14 years falling asleep to it. The distant alarm calls of deer, the slow percussion of insects, the occasional deep exhalation of a large cat moving through undergrowth somewhere beyond the tree line. Inside those walls, the nights were a different kind of dark. They were a dark that had no depth to it, no layers, no living things moving through it. He kept to himself, mostly. The other inmates left him alone, and the guards who knew the details of his case, the ones who had followed the trial in the local papers, treated him with a quiet deference that was its own kind of acknowledgement. Nobody said outright that something had gone wrong, but the silences around his name said it clearly enough. It was in the 3rd month that the warden came to him. He sat down across from Daniel in the visitation room and told him, plainly and without embellishment, what the camera footage had been showing every night since October. He described the size of the animal. He slid a printed photograph across the table, grainy, time-stamped, taken at 10:47 in the evening, and watched Daniel's face. Daniel looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. Then he pressed 2 fingers against it, lightly, as if he were touching something fragile, and the warden said that his eyes went very bright and very still at the same time. The way eyes do when a person is working hard to hold something in. He asked only one question. He asked whether she looked healthy. The warden, who was not a man given to sentiment, told him the truth. She looked like she was enduring. After that, the warden brought him a photograph every month. It became an unspoken arrangement between 2 men who never discussed its meaning out loud. Daniel would look at each image carefully, studying the coat, the posture, the way she held her head, and then he would nod once and hand it back. He never asked to keep them. I think holding onto them would have made the distance too real. Outside the wall, Kira's vigil continued with a regularity that began to feel less like animal behavior and more like calendar. The guards on the night shift started timing her arrivals. 10 past 10. Never much later. She would settle into her spot near the eastern fence, her body oriented toward the wall, and she would remain there until the sky began to lighten in the east. Then she would rise, shake herself once, and vanish back into the tree line as silently as she had come. In the 2nd year, one of the night guards, a young man from Kota named Suresh, began leaving a bucket of water just inside the fence line after dark. Nobody ordered him to do it. Nobody told him to stop. In the mornings, the bucket was always empty. It was a small gesture in the face of something enormous. But I think all of us needed to do something. Watching that kind of loyalty from the outside, without being able to answer it, was its own particular weight to carry. By the 3rd year, she had become part of the rhythm of the place. Not accepted? Exactly. A wild tiger is not something a rational person accepts, but incorporated. The guards on the east wall knew to look for her amber eyes at 10 o'clock, the way you look for a familiar landmark on a road you drive every day. Her presence had become in some way none of us could fully articulate, a reminder that something outside those walls still remembered who Daniel Mehta was, and that someone was still counting the nights. The morning of Daniel's release was a January morning, the kind that arrives without warmth or ceremony. The sky the color of old iron, and the air carrying that particular cold that settles into the bones before you have had time to prepare for it. I had come in early that day. I told myself it was routine. that I had paperwork to clear before the shift change. But the truth is, I wanted to be there. I think most of us did. By 7 in the morning, there were more staff in the Eastern Corridor than any ordinary processing required. Nobody acknowledged it. We all found reasons to be somewhere near the main gate, occupied with tasks that kept our eyes in the right direction. The warden stood near the door to the administrative block, with his arms folded and his face arranged into its usual neutrality. But I noticed he had arrived 40 minutes before his scheduled time. Daniel came through the interior checkpoint at 7:23. He was thinner than he had been. 3 years will do that to a man, regardless of how he carries himself, but he walked with a steadiness that I found difficult to look at directly. The way you find it difficult to look directly at something that has endured more than it should have had to. He signed the final release documents without rushing. He collected his belongings from the property office in a bag that wasn't very full. Then he walked toward the main gate, and the gate swung open, and he stepped out into the gray January light. I was positioned near the eastern wall. I had a clear line of sight to the fence line and to the tree line beyond it. And what I saw in the next 30 seconds is something I have tried many times to describe accurately, and I am still not sure I have the right words for it. She was already there, not in her usual spot, not sitting at her customary distance. She was pressed against the fence itself, her massive body aligned with the chain link, her head turned toward the gate. She must have come in before dawn, before any of us had taken our positions, and she had moved closer than she had ever come in 3 years of vigils. The fur along her shoulders was raised slightly. Every muscle in her body was oriented toward the sound of that gate. Daniel stopped walking the moment he saw her. He stopped completely, one foot still half raised, and the bag dropped from his hand into the dirt without him noticing. For a moment, neither of them moved. The cold air sat between them, perfectly still, as if the world had taken a breath and forgotten to release it. Then Kira made a sound. I had heard tigers vocalize before. The deep chuffing, the territorial roar carried across kilometers of forest. But this was neither of those things. It was low and continuous, almost a vibration more than a sound. The kind of noise that bypasses your ears and registers somewhere older in the body. Suresh, standing beside me, put his hand flat against the wall as if he needed to feel something solid. I understood exactly why. Daniel walked toward her slowly, not with caution. There was no hesitation in his steps, no fear, only the careful deliberateness of someone approaching something sacred. He knelt down at the fence and she pressed her enormous head against the chain link, and he placed both hands flat against her face, one over each eye, and he bowed his head forward until his forehead touched the metal between them. I counted the seconds without meaning to. 1, then 2, then 3. And in those seconds I felt something shift in the air around us, something that had been held under pressure for a very long time, finally, quietly, releasing. Behind me, I heard the warden clear his throat once. I did not turn to look at his face. Some things deserve their privacy. I spoke with Daniel only once after that morning. It was about 3 weeks after his release on an afternoon when he had come back to the prison, not as an inmate, but as a visitor, to collect a final document from the administrative office. I found him standing near the eastern fence on his way out, looking at the tree line with his hands in his pockets and his face turned slightly upward, the way a person looks when they are listening for something specific in a place where most people hear nothing at all. I asked him how he was doing. It was an inadequate question and we both knew it, but he answered it honestly. He said he was still learning how to sleep through the night without the walls. He said the forest felt different now. Not smaller exactly, but more fragile. The way things feel when you have come close to losing them and understand for the first time that losing them was genuinely possible. I asked him about Kira. His expression changed in a way I had not seen before. Not softening, exactly, but opening, like a room with a window suddenly unlocked. He told me that she had moved her primary range back to the Eastern Corridor within days of his release, that the tracking collar data showed her settling into patterns she had abandoned 3 years earlier. She was hunting well. Her coat was improving. The Wildlife Center staff had documented a visible change in her condition within the first 2 weeks, though they were careful in their official reports about the language they used to explain it. I asked him the question I had been carrying since January. I asked him what he thought she had understood during those 3 years about where he was and why he wasn't coming back. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fence with an expression that held no easy answers and didn't pretend to. Then he said that he didn't think she had understood any of it. Not the trial, not the injustice, not the bureaucratic machinery that had taken him away from her. He said that was precisely the point. She had not waited because she understood the situation. She had waited because she did not have the capacity for the kind of reasoning that would have told her to stop. She had no framework for betrayal, No mechanism for deciding that 3 years was too long. No internal voice that whispered about probability or practicality or moving on. She had only the fact of his absence and the place where his presence had last been. And so she had gone to that place and she had stayed. Every night, without negotiation, without diminishment, without a single evening when the cold or the dark or the passage of time had been a sufficient reason to turn back. I have thought about what Daniel said many times since that afternoon. I have thought about it on difficult nights when patience felt like an unreasonable demand, when loyalty seemed like a cost that rational people shouldn't be expected to pay. And I always come back to the same image. A tiger pressing her face against a chain-link fence in the dark, her amber eyes fixed on a wall of concrete, her breath clouding in the cold night air, not asking for anything, not performing anything. Simply present in the oldest and most complete sense of that word. We spend so much of our lives calculating what things are worth, how long to wait, how much to give, when the balance tips too far toward loss. We build elaborate architectures of self-protection and call it wisdom. And then something wild and wordless sits down outside our walls and renders all of that arithmetic completely beside the point. Kira didn't know she was teaching anyone anything. She was just being what she was. But I have never stopped being grateful that I was there to watch her do it.